The dawn before time, chaos, and the birth of the world. Before the first sunrise, before the gods claimed their thrones, there was nothing. No earth beneath our feet, no ocean waves, no whisper of wind. There was only chaos. Not chaos as we understand it today, but a boundless emptiness, an infinite silence stretching beyond imagination. It was not disorder, but absence, a dark, yawning gulf where neither light nor shadow yet existed. It had no heartbeat, no will, no warmth. It simply was. From that profound stillness stirred the first spark of being. Out of chaos emerged Gaia, the earth, vast and unyielding, the mother of all that would come. Beneath her grew Tartarus, the deep pit of shadow, not evil, merely depth itself. And from the faintest shimmer between them came Eros, the primal force of love and attraction. Not the playful god of later tales, but a cosmic energy that pulled existence together, binding form to formlessness, giving unity to what had been scattered in the void. They were not gods in the sense we later imagine, no golden palaces or winged chariots, but principles given shape. Gaia was soil and mountain and womb. Tartarus was the abyss waiting below. Eros was the pulse that made the stars seek one another across eternity. And through them, the universe began to breathe. From chaos came more. Nyx, the night, cloaked in black so deep that even the void recoiled. Alongside her came Erebus, the darkness, filling the corners of creation with shadow. Together, night and darkness embraced. And from that union were born two children, Aether, the bright upper air that only gods would breathe, and Hemera, the radiant day, who would forever chase her mother across the newborn sky. Thus, before time had meaning, the rhythm of night and day was born, not through science or the spinning of planets, but through divine pursuit, a mother and daughter endlessly circling the heavens.
Gaia, fertile and patient, grew restless beneath this stillness. From her depths she brought forth Uranus, the sky, her sun, her mirror, and soon her consort. When he stretched his star-filled body above her, the world found its first shape, earth below, sky above, and the vast breadth between them. Their joining formed the foundation of all that would come, the first union, the first act of creation. From their embrace came the Titans, the great first generation of beings, neither mortal nor divine as we know it, but vast forces wearing the faces of gods. There were 12, 6 sons and 6 daughters, each embodying a fundamental truth of existence. Among the sons were Oceanus, who encircled the world in his endless river, Hyperion, lord of heavenly light, Coos, the axis of inquiry and intellect, Krios, bearer of constellations, Iapetus, the forefather of mortal men, and Cronus, the youngest, patient and cunning, who watched and waited where others acted. Their sisters were no less grand: Thea, shining mother of the sun and moon; Rhea, destined to birth gods; Themis, the spirit of divine order and justice; Mnemosyne, keeper of memory; Phoebe, radiant and prophetic; and Tethys, the nourishing sea. Together they were the pillars of a new cosmos, the children of sky and earth, bound by blood and bound by destiny. But Gaia's womb did not rest with them. She gave life to beings far more terrible: the Cyclopes, 3 one-eyed giants whose names echoed thunder itself: Bruntes, Steropes, and Argus. Their single blazing eyes burned like molten gold, and from their forges would one day come the weapons of gods: thunderbolts, tridents, and fire itself. And still Gaia labored. From her came the Hecaton Kyries, the 100-handed ones, each with 50 heads and 100 arms, vast as mountains, terrible and mighty. When they moved, the ground trembled and the seas recoiled. They were strength unmeasured, chaos given muscle. Uranus, lord of the sky, gazed upon these monstrous children and was stricken with fear. He saw in their power not wonder, but danger. And so, in his pride and dread, he forced them down, pressing them back into Gaia's own womb, burying them alive beneath the layers of earth and grief. The world above grew quiet again, but within, the mother groaned with pain and rage. Her mountains shuddered, rivers trembled. Her heart, once patient, began to turn toward vengeance. Each night Uranus descended to her, stretching his star-filled body across her form, deaf to her cries, blind to her suffering. He claimed her again and again, and each time her anger deepened until it was as vast as the void that had once been. And from that fury, she forged a plan.
From her own flesh, Gaia created a weapon, not of bronze or iron, for no such things yet existed, but of unbreakable stone, a sickle of sharpest flint, curved like the moon, jagged like truth. Then she called upon her children, the Titans, and spoke to them through the trembling roots of the world. "Your father has wronged me," she said, her voice echoing through the stone. "He has buried your brothers in darkness and chained the womb that gave you life. Who among you will stand beside me?" One by one, the Titans looked away. None dared defy Uranus. None except one. The youngest, Cronus, clever and calculating, stepped forward. He said, "I will do it. Give me the blade." And so Gaia and Cronus set their trap. When night fell and Uranus descended once more, Cronus lay hidden in the shadows of the mountains. The stars themselves held their breath. As the sky bent low to meet the earth, Cronus struck. The sickle flashed, cutting through divine flesh. Uranus's cry split the heavens, the first thunder the world had ever heard. From his wound fell blood that soaked the soil, and from the sea foam that gathered around his severed power, something extraordinary arose. From the white froth of the waves, Aphrodite was born, beauty itself, radiant and terrible, stepping ashore at Cyprus, untouched by violence, though born of it. Her eyes held both mercy and ruin. She was love and its cost made flesh.
But Gaia's vengeance was not yet complete. From the blood that dripped upon the earth sprang new beings, the Erinyes, or Furies, cloaked in vengeance, destined to haunt oath-breakers and kinslayers until the end of days. From that same blood rose the giants, who would one day challenge the gods themselves, and the Melii, nymphs of the ash trees, keepers of the old wild ways. As for Uranus, bleeding and broken, he fled into the farthest reaches of the sky, becoming what we still see above, eternal, untouchable, distant. Yet before he vanished, he spoke a final curse, a prophecy that would echo through the ages. As I have been overthrown by my son, so too shall he fall by his own child. Cronus heard and trembled, though he said nothing. He took the throne of the heavens and ruled as king of the Titans. But from the moment he claimed it, he was haunted by the words of his father's dying curse. Power, once taken, can never truly be trusted. Still, for a time, the world thrived. The Titans ruled in what poets would later call the Golden Age, an era of peace and abundance. There was no war, no winter, no want. Rivers ran sweet, the harvest never failed, and humankind, then young and innocent, lived without toil or sorrow. Justice walked among men unseen. It was a time before greed, before kings or temples, when the earth's gifts came freely and hearts were unburdened.
But peace, as always, cannot last forever. Cronus took Rhea, his sister, as his queen, wise, steadfast, and full of hidden grief. When her first child was born, a daughter named Hestia, Cronus remembered the curse. Fear twisted his heart. He took the newborn and, before Rhea could speak, swallowed her whole. Rhea wept, but he was unmoved. When her second child, Demeter, was born, he did the same. Then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. One by one, he devoured them, believing he could outwit fate by consuming it. By the time her sixth child stirred within her, Rhea's sorrow had hardened into resolve. She went to her mother Gaia and begged for guidance. The great earth listened and whispered a plan. When the child came, a son named Zeus, Rhea hid her away on the island of Crete, deep within a cave on Mount Ida. There, sacred nymphs raised him in secret, feeding him honey and the milk of the divine goat Amalthea, whose horn would later become the cornucopia, symbol of endless abundance. In the newborn god's place, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and gave it to Cronus. Without suspicion, he swallowed it whole, believing he had consumed his final child. And so, for the first time, the wheel of fate turned against the Titan king. Zeus grew strong, fierce as the storm, wise as his mother, and bold as his grandmother. From Gaia, he learned the old truths of his father's fear and the darkness within the earth. And when the time was right, he rose to claim his destiny. Thus ended the stillness of the Golden Age, and began the storm that would shake the heavens. The Titanomachy, the war of gods and titans. But that is a tale for another night. For now, remember, in the beginning there was no Olympus, no crown, no thunderbolt, only a void that dreamed of form, and a mother, vast as the world itself, who refused to suffer in silence. The war of the Titans and the rise of Olympus. High above the silent world, the stars watched as destiny stirred. Deep within the earth, in caverns veiled by stone and time, the young god Zeus grew beneath the hum of thunder. Hidden from the eyes of his father, he was raised not in luxury, but in secrecy. The nymphs of Crete rocked his cradle to the rhythm of storms, and the curates, armored guardians, clashed their shields together so that the cries of the infant would not reach the ears of Cronus, the Titan king. As Zeus grew, he learned the world's hidden language, the whisper of wind, the pulse of rivers, the murmur of flame. He listened to Gaia, the earth herself, who spoke softly from her roots and told him of the injustice that had buried his siblings inside his father's stomach. She told him that the world above might bloom again, but only if he faced what he feared most, his own blood. In time, Zeus became strong, not only in muscle, but in will. His eyes carried the color of storm clouds, and his voice rolled like distant thunder. One day, he left his mountain refuge and journeyed into the wider world. He wandered through valleys where time still slept, across rivers that remembered the dawn of creation, until he came upon Metis, the goddess of wisdom and cunning thought. She saw in him the gleam of destiny, and in her craft she guided him. "You cannot face Cronus by strength alone," she said. "He devoured his children not because he was mighty, but because he was afraid. Fear can be tricked, power cannot." Zeus listened, and under her counsel he prepared a potion made of herbs grown in the tears of Gaia herself and stirred by the breath of night itself. With this he would bring his father to ruin, not by blade, but by cunning. Disguised as a cupbearer, Zeus entered the golden hall of Cronus on Mount Othrys. The Titan king, vast and crowned with shadow, sat upon a throne of black marble. Around him gathered the elder gods, Rhea by his side, silent and watchful. Zeus bowed low and offered the cup, his hands steady, though his heart thundered within him. Cronus drank, laughing deep and cold. "A fine brew," he said. But his laughter turned to a choke, and his choke to a roar. The potion burned through him like fire and flood. He rose, clutching his chest, as the spell of Metis did its work. One by one, he began to retch forth his children, first Hestia, then Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, each reborn into the light, trembling but alive. When the last had emerged, Zeus cast aside his disguise. "Your reign is over, Father," he said. "The sky is no longer yours to command." Cronus, weakened but defiant, drew his sickle of stone once more. "You are bold, boy," he said, "but you forget. I am time itself, and time devours all." And so began the Titanomachy, the war that would shake heaven and earth for 10 years and remake the order of existence. The Titanomachy, War of the Immortals. The Titans gathered upon Mount Othrys, their ancestral fortress, while Zeus and his freed siblings rallied upon Mount Olympus. Between them lay the vast plains of Thessaly, which would soon become a battlefield of gods. The sea churned, the mountains cracked, and the stars dimmed as both sides readied their strength. The Titans were ancient, colossal beings whose veins ran with raw power. With Cronus as their commander stood Iapetus, lord of mortality, Hyperion, who burned with light, Atlas, whose shoulders could hold the sky, and Coeus, whose mind was sharper than any blade. Their roars alone could level forests. But the younger gods, the Olympians, had something their elders lacked: hunger. They were not content with the world as it was. They burned with vision, with ambition, and with the restless fire of change. At their head stood Zeus, his thunderbolt blazing like a newborn star. Beside him stood Poseidon, armed with his trident that shook the seas, and Hades, whose helm could render him unseen. Hera, Demeter, and Hestia lent their power to sustain the cause, their prayers and curses weaving through the air like smoke. And yet the Titans endured. For every mountain Zeus shattered, they raised another. For every storm Poseidon conjured, Oceanus rose to calm the seas. For every shadow Hades spread, Hyperion burned brighter. Years passed, and the battle raged without end. Even the immortal grew weary. It was Gaia, once again, who spoke to her grandson. "You fight with fury, child," she said, "but fury alone cannot unmake eternity. If you would end this war, seek allies from below, those whom your father cast into darkness." Zeus descended into Tartarus, the deepest pit of existence, where the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones, lay imprisoned in chains of unbreakable stone. Their eyes burned with madness and rage, their 100 arms twitching restlessly in the dark. "I have come to set you free," Zeus said, his voice echoing through the abyss. "If you fight beside me, I will shatter your chains forever." The eldest of them, Briareus, rumbled like an earthquake. "Long have we waited for a god who remembers the forgotten." And so they rose, tearing apart their bonds as though they were cobwebs. The gates of Tartarus opened, and with them came thunder, fire, and vengeance. From their forges deep within the earth, The Cyclopes too answered Zeus's call. They crafted weapons for the young gods, a trident for Poseidon that could split the seas, a helm of darkness for Hades that could hide even from light, and for Zeus, the thunderbolt, forged from the heart of a storm and tempered in divine flame. It was the most terrible weapon ever made, and with it, the tide of war began to turn.
The final battle shook the foundations of the world. Olympus blazed with lightning, Orthrus burned with fire, and the space between became a storm without end. Cronus struck with his sickle, slicing through mountains as though they were smoke. But Zeus met him with the thunderbolt, and their clash blinded the heavens. Poseidon raised waves higher than mountains, crashing them upon the Titan's fortress. Hades emerged from the shadows unseen, striking fear into their minds before vanishing again. Atlas stood tall, his arms wide as the horizon, trying to hold back the storm itself. But Briareus hurled 100 stones at once, crushing the armies of the Titans beneath their own mountain walls. Hyperion's light dimmed. Iapetus fell, wounded by Zeus's thunder. Cronus, seeing his brothers fall, bellowed with fury and struck once more, but the sickle shattered upon Zeus's shield. The earth itself screamed as the Titans were cast down, bound in chains of adamantine, unbreakable even by divine hands. They were hurled into Tartarus, the prison their own fear had built. There they would remain, guarded by the 100-handed ones, who now served as wardens of the abyss. Cronus, last of the fallen, looked upon his son one final time. "You think yourself free of fate," he said, "but the day will come when your own child will rise against you. The wheel turns forever." Zeus said nothing. He sealed the gates of Tartarus with a thunderbolt.
The division of the realms. When the war was done, the world was silent again. The mountains were scarred, the rivers rerouted, and the air smelled of smoke and storm. The Titans had fallen. The age of Olympus had begun. The three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, met atop a high peak to divide the cosmos among themselves. They drew lots, each trusting fate more than greed. Zeus drew the sky, realm of thunder and light. Poseidon drew the sea, realm of tides and storms. Hades drew the underworld, the silent realm of the dead. The earth itself, Gaia's flesh, was left as neutral ground, shared by gods and mortals alike. None would claim it fully, for it was both cradle and grave, the one domain that belonged to all. With that, the brothers swore an oath never to wage war against one another, for the memory of their father's fall was still raw. Together they built Mount Olympus, a fortress of cloud and marble, so high that even storms bowed before it. Its halls were radiant, its air eternal, its summit crowned with fire that never died. The dawn of the Olympians. And so began the reign of the Olympians. Zeus, king of gods and men, ruled from his throne of thunder. He governed not only with might, but with judgment, rewarding loyalty and punishing arrogance. His gaze was vast, his will unyielding, yet his heart, ever restless, would one day sow chaos of a different kind. Beside him sat Hera, his sister and queen, proud and vengeful, goddess of marriage and sovereignty. Though her love for Zeus burned bright, so too did her jealousy, for he was never faithful. Their union, though divine, would echo the same flaws as those of mortal men: power, passion, betrayal. Poseidon built his palace beneath the waves, its floors of coral and pearl. His trident ruled every current, and his moods ruled the sea itself. Sailors would come to fear his anger and pray for his mercy with each voyage. Hades, quiet and stern, withdrew to his shadowed realm below, where no sun could reach. He did not envy Olympus, nor desire its light. In his kingdom, he became judge and keeper of the dead, ensuring the balance of life and death remained unbroken. The sisters too found their domains. Demeter tended the fields and made the earth fertile. Hestia kept the sacred flame alive in every hearth, both mortal and divine. Hera ruled the sacred vows of family and queenhood. And from these seven, the three brothers and their three sisters, joined by fate, the order of Olympus took root. Zeus then summoned others to join their ranks: Athena, born from his own mind; Apollo, the radiant god of light and prophecy; Artemis, the huntress; Ares, the blood-soaked god of war; Aphrodite, love incarnate; Hermes, messenger and trickster; and Hephaestus, the divine smith. Together, they formed the 12 Olympians, the new divine order of heaven and earth. From their thrones, they would shape the destinies of gods and men alike.
The silence after the storm. In the aftermath of victory, the world found a strange calm. The rivers ran clear again. The stars returned to their places. Yet beneath the peace lay a quiet warning that no power lasts forever, not even for gods. Zeus stood upon the heights of Olympus and looked down upon the world he had remade. He heard the whisper of his father's curse, carried still in the wind. As I have been overthrown, so shall you be. He said nothing, but in his heart he knew every throne, no matter how high, casts a shadow. And though the sky was his now, it would never truly belong to him. The war of Titans had ended, but the age of gods, with all its triumphs, loves, betrayals, and tragedies, had only just begun. The world had at last found its rhythm again. The storm had passed. From the smoldering remains of the Titan war rose a new order, shimmering and uncertain. Olympus, the realm of gods, radiant above all. Its golden halls hung between the clouds, its columns glimmered with unmelting light, and its air was filled with the scent of cedar and lightning. Here the immortals took their thrones,
not in silence, but in the grand chorus of divine existence. And at the summit of it all sat Zeus, ruler of heaven and earth. His throne was carved from storm clouds and veined with fire. His gaze, calm yet terrible, stretched across all creation. He was not merely a king. He was law, order, and inevitability. Beside him sat Hera, queen of gods, her beauty as sharp as a blade, her pride unbending. She ruled the sanctity of marriage and the bonds of oath. Yet behind her regal calm flickered a storm of jealousy, for her husband's heart was as restless as the sky itself. From this uneasy union, the new pantheon began to form, each god and goddess taking their domain as stars take their places in the night. The children of Olympus. First among them was Athena, goddess of wisdom, strategy, and just war. She was not born of womb or labor, but from the very mind of Zeus. When the time of her birth came, Zeus was struck by an unbearable pain in his skull. His cries shook Olympus until Hephaestus, the divine smith, split open the god's head with a hammer of bronze. From within sprang Athena, fully grown, clad in gleaming armor, holding a spear and shield. Her eyes burned with intelligence. Her voice was clear as the wind before dawn. She was the embodiment of reason, strategy, and the courage born not of rage, but of understanding. The cities of men would one day build their laws and their walls under her guidance. She became the patron of Athens, where mortals learned to seek wisdom before bloodshed. Then came Apollo and Artemis, twins born to Leto, whose name meant hidden. Leto had fled across the earth, pursued by Hera's wrath, until she found refuge on the floating island of Delos, where she gave birth beneath the light of 1,000 stars. Apollo emerged radiant as the sun itself, god of music, prophecy, and healing. His lyre tamed storms, his words guided kings. He claimed the oracle at Delphi, where mortals came to seek the future in riddles and visions. Artemis, his twin sister, was the huntress of the wild. She roamed forests untamed, protector of maidens and beasts alike. The moon was her companion, the bow her voice. While Apollo illuminated the world with reason and song, Artemis cloaked it in mystery and silence. Together, they embodied the balance between light and shadow, the twin forces that shaped both gods and mortals. Hephaestus and Aphrodite. From fire and craft came Hephaestus, the lame god of the forge. Cast down from Olympus by his mother Hera for his deformity, he fell for 9 days and 9 nights before landing in the sea. There he was tended by nymphs who taught him the art of shaping metal and flame. He rose again, scarred but brilliant, building wonders unmatched, palaces of gold, thrones that moved of their own will, arms fit for gods. His hands, though burned, created beauty from ruin. To him, in irony or in cruelty, was given Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire. Born not of womb but of sea foam, she rose from the waves near Cyprus, radiant and terrible in her beauty. Wherever she walked, flowers bloomed and hearts faltered. Yet she was not merely beauty, she was the spark of longing, the ache of creation itself. Even the gods could not resist her. Though married to Hephaestus, her passions lay elsewhere, with Ares, god of war. Together they wove a tapestry of love and destruction, each kiss a battle, each quarrel a wound. Ares, god of blood and fury. Where Athena represented wisdom in warfare, Ares was its unrestrained shadow. He reveled in conflict, in the crash of spear against shield, in the terror of men before the charge. His arrival on the battlefield was marked by screams and the scent of iron. To the Greeks, Ares was both revered and feared, a reminder that war, though divine in form, was monstrous in consequence. Even among the gods he was restless. His heart, untamed and wild, found its only peace in the arms of Aphrodite. Their union was passion unbound, destructive yet magnetic, the eternal dance of desire and death. Hermes, the boundary keeper. Then came Hermes, son of Zeus and the nymph Maia. From the moment of his birth he was cunning. Before the sun had risen on his first day, he had stolen Apollo's cattle and invented the lyre to distract him from his anger. Zeus, rather than punishing him, laughed and made him messenger of the gods. Swift and clever, Hermes moved between realms, from Olympus to earth, from the living to the dead. He was the god of travelers, thieves, merchants, and dreams, the one who guided souls to the underworld when their mortal breath was spent. Hermes represented motion itself, the idea that no boundary was truly fixed, that life was an endless crossing between beginnings and endings. Demeter and Persephone. In the green fields of the world, Demeter, goddess of grain and fertility, tended the soil. Every seed was her promise, every harvest her hymn. She was mother to Persephone, a child of light and laughter. But the peace of their bond was shattered when Hades, lord of the underworld, saw Persephone and loved her. From beneath the earth he rose in his chariot of obsidian and carried her away into shadow. Demeter searched the world in grief. She cursed the earth and nothing grew. The rivers dried, the trees withered, and even the gods began to hunger. Zeus, moved by the suffering of mortals, sent Hermes to broker a truce. Persephone would return, but only part of the year, for she had eaten pomegranate seeds in the realm of the dead. Thus she was bound to both worlds, daughter of the harvest above, queen of the underworld below. When she returned, Demeter rejoiced, and the world blossomed anew, spring. When she descended again, Demeter mourned, and the world grew barren, winter. Through them, the Greeks found meaning in the turning of seasons, in death that became rebirth. Hestia and the sacred flame. At the heart of Olympus sat Hestia, the eldest of the Olympians, goddess of the hearth. She did not seek power or praise, nor did she wage in love or war. Her gift was peace, the warmth of fire, the stillness of a home. Every flame kindled in every house was her temple. She received the first and last offering of every meal, for she symbolized continuity, the unbroken circle of family and life. When the other gods quarreled, Hestia remained still, a quiet reminder that even the divine required balance. The Age of Heroes. As Olympus grew radiant, the world of mortals stirred below. Men built cities, sailed across seas, and whispered prayers into the wind. The gods, though immortal, could not remain distant. They descended, sometimes in glory, sometimes in disguise, to mingle with humankind. From these divine unions came the demigods, children of both heaven and earth, caught between eternity and mortality. Their lives were short but bright, burning like comets across the firmament of myth. Foremost among them was Heracles, son of Zeus and the mortal queen Alcmene, conceived through deception. Born under Hera's curse, his life was marked by suffering and triumph. Even as an infant, he strangled serpents sent to kill him. As a man, he was driven mad by Hera's vengeance and killed his own family. To atone, he was bound to the will of a mortal king and sentenced to perform 12 labors, tasks no man could endure. He fought the Nemean lion, slew the Hydra, cleansed the stables of Augeas, captured the Cyrenian hind, and descended into Hades itself to bring back the hound Cerberus. Through each trial, Heracles faced not monsters, but the very essence of human endurance, pain, guilt, and redemption. At his death, he was granted divinity, ascending to Olympus, where even Hera at last forgave him. Heracles became a symbol of mortal perseverance, the idea that strength lies not in invincibility, but in the will to rise again. Another hero, Perseus, was born of prophecy and fear. His mother, Dione, was imprisoned in a bronze tower, for her father had heard a prophecy that her son would one day kill him. Yet Zeus came to her in the form of golden rain, and Perseus was conceived. Abandoned at sea, he survived and grew to manhood, only to be tasked with an impossible quest to slay Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turned men to stone. With Athena's guidance and Hermes' sword, Perseus struck her down, using the reflection in his shield to avoid her deadly eyes. From her blood sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, proof that from horror, beauty may yet be born. Then came Theseus, slayer of the Minotaur, Jason, who sailed for the Golden Fleece, Atalanta, the swift huntress who ran faster than the wind. Each hero bore divine blood, but mortal hearts. Each one reminded the world that even those touched by gods must bleed to find glory. The gift of fate. Yet heroes could not escape. what the Greeks called Moira, fate. It was not a god, nor an enemy, but the invisible law that bound gods and mortals alike. The Moirai, 3 sisters, governed it. Clotho, who spun the thread of life, Lochesis, who measured it, and Atropos, who cut it. Even Zeus, for all his power, could not defy their shears. In this, the Greeks saw their greatest truth, that destiny is not a prison, but a pattern. The gods themselves could not unweave it. They could only play their part within its tapestry. The immortal mirror. As the gods ruled from their heights and heroes walked the earth, the 2 worlds began to mirror one another. The passions of Olympus echoed in the hearts of men. Love and envy, ambition and pride, mercy and vengeance. In this reflection, the Greeks saw something profound, that divinity was not perfection, but the magnification of humanity itself. The gods were not beyond them, they were within them. And so, temples rose across the world, to Zeus on his mountaintop, to Athena in her city of marble, to Apollo at Delphi, to Demeter in her fertile plains. In every prayer, in every flame, mortals reached upward, and the gods looked downward, their gazes meeting in a brief, eternal exchange. The age of heroes would not last forever, but while it burned, it cast a light so bright that even centuries later, its echoes would still be heard in stories, in dreams, and in the beating of human hearts. The shadow below, the underworld and the mysteries of death. Beneath the trembling earth, far below the roots of mountains and rivers, there lies a kingdom without sunrise, a realm that belongs neither to the living nor the truly dead. It is the underworld, the dominion of shadows, where time moves differently, where the souls of mortals drift like whispers on cold air. This was the last and quietest of the divine realms, not born in thunder like Olympus, nor in storm like the sea, but in silence. And its ruler was Hades, the eldest brother of Zeus and Poseidon, the one who drew the darkest lot when the world was divided. He ruled not in cruelty, but in permanence. His throne, carved from onyx and obsidian, was unmoving, untouched by the chaos of the living world. His word was final, his law absolute, for in his realm all debts were paid, even those the gods could not escape.
The kingdom of the dead. To the Greeks, death was not an end, but a crossing, a slow passage into shadow. The soul, once freed from the body, became a breath of wind, a psyche lighter than dust. Guided by unseen hands, it drifted toward the borders of the underworld, to a land both familiar and strange. At the edge of this realm flowed 5 rivers, each one carrying its own truth. Styx, the river of hatred, upon which oaths of gods were sworn. Acheron, the river of sorrow, its black waters echoing with mortal lament. Cocytus, the river of wailing, where the cries of the unburied clung to the mist. Phlegethon, a river of fire that hissed and seared, burning but never consuming. And Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, where souls drank to erase their memories of life. Together, these rivers wound like veins through the bones of the world, encircling Hades' realm in an endless loop of grief and renewal. At their crossing stood Charon, the ferryman, an ancient hooded shade who carried the souls of the dead across the Acheron in his small creaking boat. For a single coin he would grant passage. Those buried without offering, the poor, the lost, the forgotten, were left to wander the shores for 100 years, calling out to a world that would no longer hear them.
The Gates and the Guardian. At the gates of the underworld stood Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades. His eyes burned with the fire of unending watchfulness. His fangs gleamed like ivory spears. He did not attack the dead. He guarded them. No soul entered without right, and none who had crossed the river could leave. Beyond the gate stretched vast plains of shadow, the asphodel fields, a place neither of joy nor torment, but of eternal sameness. Here wandered the countless dead, kings and beggars, warriors and poets, stripped of their pride, their memories faint as smoke. They murmured to one another in forgotten tongues, reliving fragments of life as dreams. Yet not all souls were equal. In the deeper reaches of Hades, where the black wind howled, lay Tartarus, a prison of torment reserved for the wicked and the oath-breakers. Here the Titans still groan in chains of lightning. Here Sisyphus strained eternally to push his boulder uphill, only to watch it fall again. Tantalus, who had betrayed the trust of the gods, stood neck-deep in water he could never drink, beneath fruit he could never reach. Each punishment was not cruelty, but reflection, a mirror of the life they had lived and the pride they had failed to tame. In contrast, beyond the gloom lay the Elysian fields, the paradise of heroes, a land of golden light where soft winds carried songs of peace and where the great souls of mortals feasted eternally. Achilles, Odysseus, and those who had faced the world with courage dwelt there, free from pain, their names sung by generations. Between these realms, at the crossroads of eternity, stood Hades' black palace, quiet, unadorned, eternal.
The Lord below. Hades was no devil, no tempter. He was the custodian of balance. While Zeus commanded the heavens and Poseidon the seas, Hades ruled the silence beneath, the place where all journeys ended. He was called Pluton, the wealthy one, not for gold or gems alone, but because every life eventually became his possession. The earth's veins, silver, iron, precious stones, all belonged to him. So too did the secrets buried with the dead,
Hades rarely left his realm. He neither demanded worship nor craved sacrifice. He simply was. But the world above could not ignore him forever. One day, the boundaries between light and shadow trembled, and the story of Persephone began. The abduction of Persephone. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, was the joy of spring itself. Her laughter was the sound of flowers opening. Her touch awakened the fields. One morning, as she gathered blossoms in the vale of Nysa, the earth split open. From the chasm rose Hades in his chariot of night, drawn by black stallions with manes of smoke. He seized her and vanished into the abyss before her companions could cry out. The world above fell silent. Demeter's screams echoed across heaven and earth. She searched for her daughter ceaselessly, refusing to let the land grow or the seeds rise. Crops failed, famine spread. Even the gods began to suffer as offerings ceased. At last, Zeus intervened. He sent Hermes to the underworld to reason with his brother. Hades, unwilling to release Persephone entirely, offered a compromise. Before her departure, he gave her a single pomegranate, the fruit of eternity. When she tasted it, she bound herself to his realm, and so it was decreed. She would spend half the year with her mother and half with her dark husband. When Persephone rose, Demeter rejoiced, and the world bloomed, spring. When she returned below, Demeter wept, and the fields withered, winter. Thus, through sorrow and reunion, the Greeks found a cycle that explained the pulse of life itself, the balance of death and rebirth, darkness and dawn.
The mysteries of Eleusis. From this myth grew one of the most sacred traditions in the ancient world, the Eleusinian Mysteries. In secret rites held outside Athens, initiates reenacted the story of Demeter and Persephone. They walked blindfolded through dark tunnels, symbolizing death and descent. They drank sacred brews and whispered ancient prayers, reliving the goddess's grief and the daughter's return. What they saw inside was never revealed. Those who spoke of it faced death. But it was said that those who completed the rites no longer feared the end. They believed they had glimpsed the truth behind death's veil, that the soul was not lost, but renewed. In these mysteries, the Greeks transformed myth into hope. They found in the sorrow of two goddesses the promise of something greater, that life, like the seasons, is not destroyed, only changed.
The prophets of shadow. The boundary between life and death was never absolute. At times, mortals dared to cross it. Orpheus, the musician whose song could charm stones and beasts, descended into Hades seeking his beloved Eurydice. His music softened the hearts of the Furies, even moved Hades and Persephone to pity. They allowed him to take her back, on one condition: he must not look behind him until they reached the world above. But as he neared the light, doubt seized him. He turned, and in that instant she was gone, pulled back into the dark. Orpheus returned alone, his lyre now a voice of mourning. Odysseus, too, journeyed to the underworld, guided by the enchantress Circe. There he met the shades of the fallen, Achilles, who confessed that even the glory of life was sweeter than the rule of death, Agamemnon, who warned him of treachery, and Tiresias, the blind prophet, who revealed the path home. These stories reminded the Greeks that death was not a closed gate, but a mirror, showing mortals the cost of their choices. The judgment of souls. In the depths of Hades stood 3 thrones of stone. Upon them sat the judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus, once mortal kings, now arbiters of eternity. Each soul was weighed not by power or wealth, but by the truth of its deeds. Those who had lived with honor were sent to the Elysian fields. Those who had defied divine law or broken sacred oaths were cast into Tartarus. And those who had lived neither wickedly nor virtuously wandered the gray plains of Asphodel, forgotten but not condemned. Even the gods respected these judgments, for in Hades justice was not a matter of vengeance, but of balance. The language of death. To the ancients, death spoke in signs. A bird's cry at dusk, the flicker of a dying flame, the chill in the wind, all were whispers from the unseen realm. Funeral rites were not mere custom, they were negotiations with the divine. Coins were placed in the mouths of the dead to pay Charon. Libations of wine and honey were poured into the soil to honor ancestors. Graves were marked with small stones, symbols of remembrance, the weight of love made visible. To neglect the dead was to risk their anger. To honor them was to invite their guidance. Thus the Greeks lived with death not as an enemy, but as a companion, ever present, always near. The philosophy of the afterlife. Over centuries, Greek thought deepened. Philosophers began to see the underworld not just as a place, but as a metaphor, a reflection of the human soul. Plato wrote of the soul's journey as a cycle of purification, the body a prison, the world a test. Pythagoras spoke of reincarnation, the endless return until wisdom was achieved. And the Orphics, followers of Orpheus, taught that through ritual and truth one could escape the cycle entirely, becoming one with the divine. The underworld thus became more than myth. It became philosophy, a way to understand suffering, justice, and the quiet promise of renewal. The stillness beneath the world. In the end, Hades' realm is not about torment or punishment. It is about stillness, the kind that lies between breaths, between seasons, between heartbeats. To the Greeks, this stillness was sacred. It was the silence after song, the dark soil before the sprout, the pause before dawn. It was a reminder that even gods could not live without death, for without it, life would have no meaning. And so the living built their temples to the sky, yet always buried their dead beneath the earth, close to Hades, close to truth. They knew that in the balance between light and shadow, both gods and mortals found their place. The story of Hades and Persephone was more than a myth. It was a map, a guide for every soul that would one day walk that silent road. For in the Greek mind, the end was never truly an ending. It was simply a descent before the next ascent, a season of rest before another spring. And in that eternal rhythm of death and return, of silence and song, the world itself continued to breathe. There comes a moment in every myth where the divine grows quiet, when the flames that once lit the heavens begin to dim, and the voices that thundered across mountains fade to whispers carried only by memory. For the gods of Olympus, that moment began not in war or prophecy, but in silence, the slow turning of history's wheel. New empires were rising, new philosophies were spreading, and men were beginning to look not up to the sky for answers, but inward, toward themselves. The age of heroes had passed. The songs of Achilles, Odysseus, and Heracles still echoed, but faintly. Stories recited by poets, not prayers whispered by believers. And in that quiet, the old gods began to change. The Romans and the adoption of Olympus. When the power of Greece waned, the torch of civilization passed westward to a new people, the Romans. They admired Greece deeply, its poetry, its art, its philosophy, and yet they saw themselves as inheritors, not imitators. To Rome, conquest was both religion and destiny, and as they conquered Greek lands, they absorbed not only cities and temples, but also gods. But the Romans did not worship the Olympians as the Greeks had. They reshaped them, gave them Latin names, Roman virtues, and new purpose. Zeus became Jupiter, not just the king of gods, but the personification of law and order. Hera became Juno, the guardian of family and the Roman state. Poseidon became Neptune, master of the seas that carried Rome's empire. Ares was reimagined as Mars, not chaos and slaughter, but disciplined courage and military honor. Athena softened into Minerva, a symbol of reason and civic wisdom. The Romans did not discard Olympus, they domesticated it. They took the wild divinity of Greece, the passion, the folly, the thunder, and dressed it in marble, in ritual, in empire. Religion became an institution of control, a mirror of the republic's hierarchy. The gods were invoked not as companions of mortals, but as partners in power, patrons of order, guardians of law, reflections of the state itself. The gods became symbols. In this new world, the gods no longer walked among men. Their myths were retold not as living faith, but as allegory. Poets such as Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, preserved their stories with elegance and irony, reshaping ancient myth into parable and metaphor. In his verses, the gods still acted with passion and folly, but their deeds carried new meanings, transformations of the human soul, lessons about desire, pride, and change. Virgil, in his Aeneid, took the Greek legends and gave them Roman purpose. The fall of Troy became the birth of Rome. The wanderings of Aeneas became destiny, the divine will that forged an empire. The gods were now architects of history, not wanderers among it. The Greeks had made the gods human. The Romans made them political. The expansion of faith. As Rome grew, so too did its hunger for the divine. From the east came new gods, strange, mysterious, and powerful. From Egypt arrived Isis, the mother of life and magic. From Persia came Mithras, the slayer of the cosmic bull, whose cult promised salvation through ritual sacrifice. From Anatolia came Cybele, the great mother, her worship ecstatic and wild. The temples of Jupiter and Mars stood beside foreign shrines, each promising favor, victory, or eternal peace. For a time, Rome embraced them all. It was said that within the capital there were more gods than people. Yet, with each new god adopted, the Olympians lost a little more of their hold. Their temples still gleamed, but fewer hearts knelt in true devotion. The divine had become fragmented, a marketplace of belief. The philosophers' revolt. While priests kept the altars burning, another quiet revolution began, not of faith, but of thought. The philosophers questioned the old stories. They asked whether gods who lied, loved, and killed could truly be divine. Xenophanes, centuries earlier, had mocked the human shape of the gods. He wrote, "If horses had gods, they would look like horses." Plato admired the beauty of myth, but distrusted its literal truth. He argued that true divinity must be perfect, just, and good, not bound by human jealousy or lust. For him, the gods of Homer were symbols, not beings. Epicurus went further still. He declared that the gods existed, perhaps, but cared nothing for mortals. The thunder of Zeus was only thunder. The world moved by nature's laws, not divine temper. Fear of divine punishment, he said, was the root of human misery, and reason was the cure. Even the Stoics, devout in their way, saw God not as a person, but as a principle, the logos, the rational order of the cosmos. Divinity, they taught, was not above man, but within him. These ideas spread quietly, carried by scholars and citizens alike. By the time Rome reached its height, the Olympians had already begun to fade. Not destroyed, but replaced by philosophy.
The deification of men. As belief in Olympus waned, a strange irony emerged. Men themselves began to take the gods' place. The emperors of Rome, wrapped in gold and power, declared themselves divine. Augustus, the first emperor, was worshipped as a living god, his household fire tended by sacred virgins, his image carried in processions. Temples were built not for Zeus or Jupiter alone, but for Caesar, for the emperor's genius. Faith had turned from heaven to earth. The divine had become political theater. To pray to Jupiter was to affirm loyalty to Rome. To question the emperor's divinity was to risk death. And so, while statues of gods still lined the marble forums, they had become symbols, not spirits, tools of empire rather than masters of it.
But from the eastern provinces came a whisper, a new belief that would shake the world. It began not in palaces or temples, but among the poor, the enslaved, the unseen. It spoke not of many gods, but of one. This god had no statue, no mountain, no thunderbolt. He was invisible, singular, absolute. He did not demand sacrifice, but faith. And his promise was not power, but salvation. This was Christianity, born from the deserts of Judea, a small, defiant flame in the shadow of empire. At first, Rome mocked it, then feared it, and finally tried to extinguish it. Thousands died in its arenas, refusing to bow to idols or emperors. But the more Rome persecuted them, the stronger they became. The old gods had bound men by fear. The new god bound them by conviction. And that conviction spread faster than armies. The silence of Olympus. By the 4th century, the world had changed beyond recognition. The temples of Zeus stood empty. The oracles of Delphi no longer spoke. The ancient rites of sacrifice were outlawed by imperial decree. Emperor Theodosius I, in 391 CE, sealed the fate of Olympus. He banned all pagan worship, closed the temples, and declared the old religions dead. The Olympic Games, once held in honor of Zeus, were abolished. The fires on the altars went out, and the gods did not answer. There was no thunder, no war, no divine resistance, only silence. The people still remembered, They told their children of Athena and Apollo, of Dionysus and Demeter, but they no longer prayed to them. The gods who had once shaped the seas and stars now lived only in the echo of stories. The afterlife of myth. Yet myths do not die. They transform. Even as faith vanished, the stories endured, carried by poets, scholars, and dreamers. In the monasteries of the Middle Ages, monks copied Homer and Hesiod by candlelight, preserving the very myths their new religion condemned. They did not worship the gods, but they could not forget them. And in their quiet scribes' hands, Olympus survived. Then came the Renaissance, a rebirth not only of art and science, but of memory. Painters once again gave form to Aphrodite rising from the sea, to Apollo crowned with light, to Zeus thundering over the world. Sculptors chiseled their forms in marble. Poets invoked their names. Philosophers studied their meaning. The gods returned, not as rulers, but as symbols of beauty, reason, and human potential. They no longer lived in the heavens. They lived in art.
By the time of the Enlightenment, belief in the literal gods of Greece and Rome had long vanished, but their ideas had taken root in something even stronger, the human imagination. Zeus became a symbol of authority. Athena represented intellect. Apollo embodied light and knowledge. Aphrodite stood for beauty and desire, and Hades reminded mankind of the balance between life and death. The myths had shifted from theology to psychology, from the cosmos to the soul. Later thinkers like Jung would call them archetypes, eternal figures representing the deepest forces within us: wisdom, rage, love, fear, ambition. The gods, he said, never left the world. They simply moved inside the human mind. And perhaps that is why they still endure. Because the Greeks, in giving their gods human flaws and human hearts, made them timeless. They did not create perfection. They created reflection. So when we look upon the ruins of Olympus, we do not see a graveyard of gods. We see a mirror of the human spirit itself. The same fire that once burned in the heart of Zeus still burns in our ambition. The same wisdom that guided Athena still speaks in our curiosity. The same beauty that stirred Aphrodite moves us in love, in art, in the search for meaning. The gods were never truly immortal because of power. They were immortal because they were stories. And stories, unlike temples, do not crumble. When the last temple fell, the myths became whispers. When the last priest died, they became poetry. And when the world forgot their names, they became ideas. In that way, they achieved what even Zeus could not: eternity.
The fall of Olympus was not a tragedy. It was a transformation. The gods had once shaped mankind. Now mankind shapes the gods, retelling their stories, reinventing their faces, rediscovering their meanings in every age. And so, though the mountain stands empty and the sky holds no thunderbolt, the spirit of the old world endures, in words, in dreams, in the endless longing for something greater than ourselves. For myths, unlike empires, never die. They simply change form. And somewhere, beyond time and stone, the gods still listen, not from thrones of marble, but from the beating hearts of those who remember.
There are stories that die with their tellers, and there are stories that refuse to die, lingering in the folds of time like embers waiting for a breath of wind. The Greek myths, once whispered in temples and shouted in battle, did not vanish when Olympus fell. They simply waited. For centuries, they slept in ink and parchment, hidden in the quiet monasteries of medieval Europe. Monks who condemned the pagan world still copied its words by candlelight, preserving the very tales they called heresy. Homer, Hesiod, and Sophocles. Their works survived not because the church believed in them, but because humanity could not bear to let them go. The gods had left the temples, but not the imagination. And when Europe awoke from its long winter, it found Olympus waiting, patient, timeless, and ready to rise again. The Renaissance. The gods return in marble and light. In the 15th century, the world began to look backward to move forward. This was the Renaissance, the rebirth of art, philosophy, and the rediscovery of classical memory. The forgotten gods returned, not as deities, but as symbols of human beauty, intellect, and ambition. In Florence, the sculptor Donatello carved David, a mortal hero with divine courage. In Rome, Michelangelo shaped marble into living flesh. His Apollo, his Bacchus, even his Adam bore the echo of Olympian perfection. And in Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, Aphrodite rose once more from the sea, not as an idol to be worshipped, but as an ideal to be understood. Artists and thinkers saw in myth not superstition, but truth, metaphorical, psychological, eternal. They realized that the Greeks had not written about gods to explain the stars, but to explain themselves. And so the myths came alive again, reinterpreted in paint, stone, and poetry. No longer confined to the heavens, the gods now lived in human form, beautiful, fallible, radiant with the spark of mortal imperfection. The philosophers of the Renaissance, called humanists, saw myth as a bridge between divine and mortal understanding. They believed that to study the ancients was not to glorify their gods, but to discover what it meant to be human. Writers like Petrarch and Erasmus rediscovered the moral and poetic power of Greek thought. They found in Plato's dialogues a divine order,
shaped not by wrath, but by reason. And in Aristotle's logic, the architecture of truth. They spoke of virtu, not divine virtue, but human excellence. The courage to act, to create, to live with purpose. And in that spirit, Zeus became Jupiter, god of order and reason. Athena became Minerva, patron of wisdom and learning. Hermes, once the trickster, became Mercury, messenger of commerce and intellect. The old myths had been reborn in new light, no longer theology, but philosophy. The gods were not resurrected to be obeyed. They were remembered to inspire.
The Enlightenment. Reason over faith. As centuries turned, Europe entered another transformation, the Age of Enlightenment. Reason replaced revelation. The telescope replaced the temple. But even then, the gods refused to disappear. Thinkers like Voltaire, Hume, and Diderot studied the myths not as sacred stories, but as mirrors of human behavior. They saw Zeus not as a god, but as power personified, the embodiment of authority and the dangers of tyranny. They saw Prometheus as rebellion, courage, and the spirit of science, the fire-bringer who defied divine order for the sake of mankind. To the Enlightenment mind, mythology was the first language of the human soul, symbolic, primitive, yet profound. In those stories of gods and heroes, they found the blueprint of psychology, the raw material of philosophy. Even as churches rose and reason reigned, the myths endured, not in temples, but in thought.
Romanticism, the return of emotion. But reason alone could not satisfy the heart. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a new movement rose to challenge cold rationality, Romanticism. The Romantics turned again to myth, not for logic, but for feeling. They saw in Orpheus the eternal artist, singing against death. In Prometheus, the rebel spirit of humanity against the gods of destiny. In Persephone's descent, the sorrow of loss and the beauty of return. And in Aphrodite's laughter, the eternal ache of love. Poets like Goethe, Keats, and Shelley saw the ancient world not as dead, but dreaming. Their verses breathed new life into myth, not as history, but as emotion, as metaphor. When Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound, he turned the old punishment into a hymn of liberation, a declaration that man, not God, would shape his own fate. And when Keats imagined Endymion, he saw divine love not as commandment, but as yearning, the immortal reaching for the mortal and the mortal daring to dream of the divine. Through Romanticism, Olympus rose again, not in the sky, but in the human heart. Then came the modern age, the age of steel, electricity, and reason sharpened to a blade. Science conquered mystery, and yet the need for myth remained. It simply changed its form. In the 20th century, thinkers like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell rediscovered what the ancients had known all along, that myths are not stories about gods, they are stories about us. Jung called them archetypes, eternal patterns of the psyche. Zeus became the archetype of authority and law. Athena, the mind's wisdom. Aphrodite, the sensual and creative force. Hermes, the trickster intellect. And Hades, the hidden self, the shadow within every soul. Campbell, in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, showed that every myth, from Greece to India to America, followed the same path, the hero's journey, a call to adventure, a descent into darkness, a return with wisdom. Achilles, Odysseus, Heracles, they were not just Greek heroes, they were symbols of transformation, of the eternal cycle of struggle and rebirth that defines the human experience. Through psychology and storytelling, myth became not ancient religion, but timeless truth. The eternal relevance of myth. Why do these stories still matter? Why, after thousands of years, do we still return to Olympus, to the underworld, to the shores of Troy? Because myth speaks the language of the soul. It is not bound by time or culture. When we hear of Prometheus defying Zeus, we feel our own defiance, our hunger for knowledge, even at a cost. When we see Persephone rise from the underworld, we understand the eternal rhythm of grief and renewal. When Odysseus sails home through storms and temptation, we recognize our own search for meaning through chaos. The gods endure because they were never really about gods. They were about us, our fears, our hopes, our hunger to become something greater. Every age rediscovers them because every age needs them. They adapt, evolve, and return in new forms, new names, new masks, but their essence remains. They are not gone. They are reincarnated. The immortal thread. From the ashes of Olympus to the marble of Florence, from the pages of Homer to the screens of Hollywood, one truth remains. The gods are not dead. They have simply learned to change. They live in our art, in our science, in our stories, and in the quiet voice inside us that whispers of destiny and wonder. They remind us that reason alone cannot feed the spirit, and that even in an age of data and machines, the soul still hungers for story. The Greeks built their myths to explain the cosmos. We keep them to understand ourselves. And as long as we tell stories, as long as we dream of more than what we see, the gods will never fade. They will walk again in new shapes, wearing our faces, speaking our words, and reminding us of the fire we once stole from heaven. Because in the end, myth is not memory, it is life itself, retold in endless forms. The Renaissance gave the gods back their faces. The Enlightenment gave them meaning. The modern world gave them memory. Now it is our turn to keep their voices alive, not in temples, but in stories, not in rituals, but in imagination. For as long as one heart still wonders, as long as one voice still tells their tale, the echo of Olympus will never die. So when the stars rise tonight, remember, you are living in the age the Greeks once dreamed of, and the myths they left behind are not ancient, they are waiting for you to listen. For the gods are never gone, they are only waiting to be remembered.
Why the myths endure. A myth survives not because it is true in fact, but because it is true in feeling. It endures because it speaks to what logic cannot hold. Science tells us how lightning forms, but Zeus reminds us how it feels to stand beneath it. History records the rise and fall of cities, but Athena shows us why they matter. Religion promises heaven, but Persephone teaches us that even in death there is renewal. The ancients understood something we often forget, that story is not decoration, it is survival. Through myth, they gave meaning to suffering, shape to chaos, and purpose to fate. And in doing so, they left behind something more lasting than empire, a language of symbols that every generation can learn to read anew. The lessons of Olympus. The Olympians were not moral saints. They lied, they loved. They raged, they erred. But in their flaws lay their power, because they reminded mortals that perfection is not divine, struggle is. From Zeus, we learned the burden of leadership, the cost of control, and the danger of pride. From Hera, the endurance of loyalty, even when it curdles into vengeance. From Athena, the triumph of intellect over impulse. From Apollo, the pursuit of harmony, the balance between creation and destruction. From Artemis, the sanctity of freedom and the wildness of the soul. From Hermes, the courage to cross boundaries, to be clever when strength fails. From Dionysus, the surrender to passion, the necessary madness that frees the spirit from iron reason. And from Hades, the acceptance of what we all must face, that even in darkness there can be order, and in endings, peace. Each god is a facet of the same eternal truth, that life is conflict, balance, and transformation, and that divinity, whatever it may be, lives in the act of becoming. Tell a story in the calm, peaceful, and deep, read as if telling a story. The shadow of fate. No Greek story is free from fate. It moves through their myths like a silent tide, inevitable, inescapable, absolute. Even the gods bowed to it. But fate to the Greeks was not cruelty, it was structure.
It was the invisible frame upon which all choices hang. Oedipus did not fall because he was cursed. He fell because he sought the truth and could not bear it. Achilles did not die young because he was doomed. He died because he chose glory over peace. And Prometheus was not punished for theft. He was punished for compassion, for giving mortals what the gods feared they might one day master: light. Fate, in Greek thought, was not a chain. It was a mirror. It showed every being, mortal or divine, what they truly were when choice was stripped away. And in that reflection, the Greeks found the truest kind of freedom, not to escape destiny, but to meet it with open eyes.
The human hero. For all the gods' might, it was the heroes who carried the greatest lessons, because they were mortal, fragile, flawed, and aware of it. Heracles showed that redemption is not born from success, but from endurance. Perseus proved that courage often walks hand in hand with fear. Theseus taught that power is hollow without purpose. Orpheus revealed the price of love and the fragility of trust. Odysseus, cunning and weary, embodied the restless human spirit, always searching, never satisfied. Each hero was a reflection of humanity's contradictions, brave and foolish, noble and selfish, victorious yet broken. Their struggles were not victories over gods, but over themselves. And that is why they endure long after Olympus faded, because in their journeys we recognize our own. The eternal feminine. Greek myth did not shy away from the feminine divine. It revered it, feared it, and misunderstood it all at once. In Athena, intellect found a woman's face. In Artemis, independence became sacred. In Aphrodite, desire was not sin, but creation's fuel. And in Demeter and Persephone, motherhood and death became parts of the same eternal cycle. But there was also Medusa, the woman turned to monster for being wronged. There was Clytemnestra, whose vengeance shattered kings, and Antigone, who stood alone against tyranny to defend the dignity of death. Through them, myth became more than story. It became a meditation on power. The Greeks understood that to worship the feminine was to confront the full spectrum of life, birth and decay, love and wrath, nurture and destruction. The divine feminine in Greek myth reminds us that creation is not gentle. It is fierce. It demands respect, not pity, and it never yields quietly.
The price of hubris. No lesson of the Greeks echoes louder than this. Do not forget what you are. Hubris, arrogance before the gods, was the one sin that all myths condemned. Not because the gods were jealous, but because hubris blinds. It makes mortals forget the limits that keep the world in balance. Icarus flew too high and burned. Narcissus gazed too long and drowned. Niobe boasted too proudly and lost everything she loved. Their punishments were not cruelty, but consequence. For in myth, the universe itself enforces humility. The Greeks believed that to forget one's place, to believe oneself untouchable, was to invite destruction. And yet, in every fall there is beauty. For only those who reach too far ever learn how close they came to the divine.
The myths changed as the world changed, but the essence, the pulse beneath the poetry, remained. When Rome rose, the gods put on new names. When Christianity came, they hid behind saints and stories. When philosophy dawned, they became symbols and archetypes. And when art bloomed, they were reborn in color, marble, and sound. Every civilization finds them again, in different guises, under different skies, because they are not bound to Greece or Rome or temple walls. They are the grammar of imagination itself, the way the human mind gives form to the formless. That is why even now, in an age of science and silence, they still return in movies, novels, and dreams. Not because we believe in them as gods, but because we need them as mirrors. They are our myths, and myth, as long as it lives, keeps humanity from forgetting its soul. The ancient Greeks did not pray as we do. Their prayers were not confessions, they were conversations. Man spoke to gods not as servant to master, but as mortal to immortal, acknowledging the vast difference, yet daring to reach across it. And in that reaching, they created something sacred, relationship. When Achilles cursed the river, when Odysseus defied Poseidon, when Prometheus mocked Zeus, they were not rebelling against belief. They were participating in it. For to the Greeks, to argue with a god was to acknowledge the divine presence within oneself. It was never submission that defined worship. It was dialogue. A dialogue that still continues every time a human being dares to question fate, to challenge injustice, to wonder if there might be more beyond the veil of the known.
What then do these ancient stories teach the modern mind? They teach us that power without wisdom destroys, that beauty without empathy corrupts, that knowledge without humility blinds, and that even the smallest act of defiance, a stolen fire, a brave word, a whispered truth, can reshape the world. They remind us that to live is to struggle, to fail, to love, to lose, and to rise again. That tragedy is not the opposite of glory, but its twin. That mortality is not a curse, but a kind of sacred urgency, the fire that makes every heartbeat matter. And perhaps most importantly, they teach us this, that myth was never meant to explain the world outside of us, but the one within. The silence after the song. When the last temple fell and the last priest of Apollo laid down his laurel crown, the world did not end. It changed. The gods withdrew, but their silence was not absence. It was invitation. They had taught, through story and symbol,
all that mortals needed to know. The rest was ours to discover. And yet, every now and then, when thunder rolls over mountains, when the sea glimmers like liquid glass, when art moves us to tears, we still feel it, that faint vibration of something vast and ancient beneath the surface of things, the breath of Olympus, the echo of the divine. The Greeks would have called it daimon, the sacred presence that moves unseen. We call it inspiration. It is the same thing.
The myths live on. The myths will never die because they are not bound to belief. They live wherever humans seek meaning. They live in every story that dares to touch eternity. When we write of heroes and villains, of love and loss, of worlds born and ended, we are still writing in the language the Greeks gave us. We still stand in the shadow of Olympus, even if we no longer build its temples. The myths do not ask for faith. They ask for remembrance. They ask that we continue to tell their stories, to whisper their names, to carry their truths through time, not as worshippers, but as witnesses.
The Greeks believed that gods and men were not separate species, but true ends of the same thread. One mortal, one divine, both bound by fate, both driven by desire, both haunted by loss. To live as a human, then, was to live in imitation of the gods, to love deeply, to err grandly, to seek wisdom, to defy limits. And in that imitation, perhaps to touch immortality, if only for a heartbeat. That is why their stories still move us, because they remind us that the divine is not somewhere above the stars, but within every act of courage, every spark of creation, every tear shed for beauty that cannot last. We do not need temples to find the gods. We only need to look inward. There, beneath the noise of the modern world, they still wait, ancient, patient, eternal, not as rulers, but as reflections, not as masters, but as memories, not as gods apart from man, but as the voice that whispers within him, "Remember what you are."
And so the tale ends, not with a battle, not with a prophecy, but with a whisper. The myths began in fire and thunder. They end in silence and light. Mount Olympus stands empty, but its echoes still roll across the ages. Every time a story is told, every time a heart dares to dream beyond its limits, the flame rekindles. Because myth, in the end, is not history. It is heritage, the living heartbeat of the imagination. It belongs to no one and to everyone. It is the language of wonder, the poetry of existence. And as long as humanity endures, as long as we seek to know who we are and why we are here, the myths will endure with us. For the gods were never truly immortal, but the stories that made them are.